Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to turn to a friend of mine, Brian Rose. He's a banker turned TV impresario, just like me. He runs a thing called London Real TV and Silicon Real right here in London near Silicon Roundabout. And he's here today. Brian, welcome to the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max. It's so nice to be here. We miss you on my show. You were on London Real and Silicon Real 3 different times. One of our most requested guests. You announced Start Join on our show, so it's...
That's right. It launched the whole thing on your show because over there on Silicon Real and the other properties that you're involved with, it's really interesting in that you are riding this wave of independent media. And the setup over there is fantastic. You know, you were the first guy that I know that used like little GoPro cameras and little cameras and set up your own mini studio. But the quality is excellent. And how did you make the transition? So you were in banking, as I was, and then now you're doing this. So how did that transition happen?
It's a great question, Max. I was in 10 years at a credit derivatives broker in the city. I moved to London specifically for that. Now I'm a citizen here, and I did that whole racket. Some of my clients were Goldman, sometimes JP Morgan, and I was broking those high-yield credit derivatives on the phones for a FTSE 100 company. And I had enough one day. I just walked out, had no idea what I was going to do, and then I started broadcasting from my studio in Shoreditch. You've been there. We started with London Real, which has been going for 3 years, which is really about people and ideas that change the world. We've had you on talking about Bitcoin. We've had other guys in finance like Peter Schiff. We've had Jim Rogers. We've also had activists like Andy Michon, Jesselyn Raddick, you know, that kind of thing.
Let me jump in for a second because you mentioned this transition from banking to independent producer, and I would imagine that's a lot more satisfying for you than credit derivative dealing. And I just thought of this question just now, but you know, there's been, I want to ask you, you know, as a fellow banker, as an American also, you know, there's been a spate of banker suicides, you know, in the last year or so. People they're suicide, they're getting killed, and you know, to me, it's people have a conspiracy theory about it. But for me, I think these are bankers that never transitioned away from something that was killing them, being in the soulless derivatives market. What do you think? Would you agree with that, or how do you see it?
I would totally agree with that. So I'm giving a TED Talk in January, and part of me is talking about the fact that I just wasn't happy. It is a soulless existence. There's no community. You're not creating anything. And that's the thing that I think a lot of guys run into, especially when they're told their whole lives that once you become a banker, once you make all this money, you're going to be happy. And ultimately, you're just not. And so that's why I think I went running away from it, because there's no innovation, there's no creativity. That's why being in the tech space is a lot of fun for me. It's the innovator's dilemma for a lot of these banks. You know, they have these markets locked down and they don't want anybody to touch them, as you know.
Yeah, I talked to Naomi Prinz, author and former Goldman Sachs partner, and she had said the same thing, that yeah, she could have been one of these suicide bankers had she not left the industry. Well, we're glad you made the transition. Glad you're here
glad
with
I didn't
us.
kill myself.
You didn't jump off a building. Now I want to talk about Silicon Roundabout, or Tech City as it's called, because you and I have had these conversations before. The culture in the UK and in Europe as a whole, it's not like Silicon Valley. It's not in America, let me put it this way. In America, it's a badge of honor to fail. In Europe and in the UK, if you fail, you're immediately a failure for life and nobody will touch you. You have the stink of failure about you. And of course, that doesn't work with an entrepreneurial startup culture. You need to fail a few times before you get it right. Is this changing, or is this still the situation? You talk about the mindset of the startup industry here in the UK.
Sure, no problem. Well, Silicon Real is my tech show. You know, it's about technology disrupting London. So we shoot that out of the same studio every week, and we talk to the founders and CEOs that are building these companies and technology that are ruining all the industries that you and I know and love, including your favorite, banking, you know, politics, retail, manufacturing, transport. You know, we had Uber on a couple weeks ago, just raised $2 billion, $40 billion valuation. But like you said, everyone looks to Silicon Valley. What can we learn from the Yanks? Because when the Yanks pitch a deal, my company's a $10 billion company. When the Brits pitch a deal, they're thinking maybe it'll be 100 million. So they kind of lack that scale of as far as how big they can scale up. Part of that is because we live in the UK and there's 70 million people, and Europe has different languages.
That's a great point. In other words, when you think of scaling up in the UK, if you get every single person in the UK in your business, that's 70 million people, which is on a global basis not much.
Right.
But the mindset is, I'm going to get everyone in this country to do this. Well, maybe if you do, that's still peanuts.
Right.
In the U.S., it's always about getting 330 million in the U.S. and getting 5 billion globally. So it's just a mindset here in the U.K. is still small-minded.
It's true, but what we are finding is fintech, financial technology. London right now is the best in the world, and it's because the banks behind us that we can see here are right next to where I am in the Silicon Roundabout, where tech is. And so you're seeing these big fintech plays. One of them is called TransferWise, where you can now move currencies from person to person. You don't have to go through the bank and get scalped. And there's other companies like Nutmeg and Doodle. And these companies, funny enough, Max, they're not trying to go to the U.S. because there's lots of funny securities laws in the U.S. You know, equity crowdfunding you still can't do in the U.S. Every state has different laws. So they kind of want to own the U.K. UK, I think, is still one of the most connected populations in the world. E-commerce is a higher percentage of UK citizens than the U.S. So some of these companies are trying to own this market and then move to the U.S. But yes, in the long run, you're going to have to conquer the U.S. market.
But there is a change in terms of you see it from your perch
I definitely
over
do.
there in Silicon Reel.
The big part is funding. You know, we never had that Series A funding, which is kind of that $1 million to $2 million to really get people off the ground. We saw the later funding. We had IPOs this year, Just Eat, and a few other billion-dollar exits, and that makes people happy. It puts money in the VC's pockets, so now they can go out there and spend it. So, yeah, Max, I'm seeing a big change. We've seen 20, 25 million, $50 million fundings in this year alone that we've never seen a few years ago. So it feels frothy. It doesn't feel bubbly. I know you saw the first bubble in tech. I was involved in it in New York City. This feels frothy, but it doesn't feel like a bubble. There's real revenues here.
Right, there are real revenues, and people like to see that type of thing. Of the guests that you've covered, and you've had some remarkable guests on the show, and including the fella who hosts the new version of Cosmos.
Yes, Neal deGrasse Tyson.
Neal deGrasse Tyson.
Yes.
And that's an interesting guest to have. You know, what was he? Tell us about that a little bit, because I think he's one of your most popular guests. I think he had maybe 200,000 views or so.
Yeah, 200,000 views, just a few more than you, but you know, it's still early days. So
no, but he's a phenomenon, a global phenomenon.
He really is.
And how did you get him?
He is a celebrity astrophysicist. That career didn't exist, you know, a year ago, and he rebooted Cosmos, which was the original Carl Sagan series. I'm sure you remember from 20, 30 years ago, and he rebooted it with Carl's ex-wife after he died. So he came through. You know, I got the chance to interview him. As we know on London Real, we have people like you talking about finance. We've got whistleblowers, but sometimes we'd like to have some fun, and so I got an hour with him. He walked into the room, and he didn't know who I was. And Neal can be a little feisty, and if you see in the beginning, he's really pushing me, and he's like, "Really, Brian, really?" And at the end of the show, he grabbed me in a wrestling hold and put me in a headlock. But I wanted to get his thoughts as far as what his life was like, how he came from a kid in the Bronx and then brought up into where he became kind of a defender of the nerds in high school. He was a wrestler, and then to become one of these most outspoken scientists.
Okay,
he transcends it. You know?
But the idea here, though, is here's a guy who I would have normally seen on 60 Minutes on CBS, right? Because he's a phenomenally successful guy right now, but here he is on your show, which you're just essentially you've transformed your flat in East London into a studio.
Right.
But the quality is the same, the questions are the same, and it was a phenomenal interview, and everyone, obviously, the numbers are there.
Well, it's on demand now, so anyone can watch it on iTunes and YouTube. So what's the difference? I mean, it helps to be on television, and you convinced me of that. Television is still going to be around, but these days, with things on demand, as long as the quality is up there, like you said, then people, why not watch us on YouTube? Why not? And plus, it's a little more real. I'm not censored. I can talk about anything we want, and it's unedited, uncut. I think people kind of like that realness these days.
Okay, so let's talk about the kind of the regulatory framework, because what happens is, you know, when you get successful, the entrenched oligopolists here in this country, you know, they call up the regulators. What's up with this upstart? You know, we don't want the competition. What can you do to block them? Do you see this trend? Is this how do you see this moving forward? You know, you're an independent. You're competing with the majors. They've got the regulators captured, essentially. How do you deal with that, if at all? I
mean, it's a concern. It's a luxury we've had for a few years now. When I had George Galloway on my show 2 years ago, he came in, saw my setup, and he was like, he's used to doing radio all his life. He said, there's no regulation, there's no off-con, and he started a podcast the next week. So, you know, he saw something there as well. You know, YouTube is a global American company owned by Google. iTunes is a global company, you know, backed by Apple. I don't see them they're going to be pushed by Ofcom. But that could happen. But I just don't see, when you have on-demand and so many different possible devices, I don't know how you're going to censor that. How can they censor us on Twitter? How can they censor these micro pieces of content like Vine? I don't know, Max. I mean, I think it'll be a real shame if they try.
Yeah, well, certainly this whole market is opening up. Also, on your show, I think when you got started, I was just kind of curious. I'm going to ask you about this. A lot of the guests, and certainly the highest profile guests, are in the, I guess you call it the bodybuilding arena and physical awareness and things like that.
Yes.
And I think you've had some experience with that, with competitive boxing and kickboxing and things. But this is another alternative sports, if you will. You know, the what do they call it? MMA or
MMA, mixed martial arts.
Mixed martial arts. You know, these are sports that have come out of nowhere, but through alternative media have found an audience. And, you know, what do you make of this deal or this company called Twitch, where you watch people play video games? When you saw that, what was your first reaction? Like, why didn't I think of that? Or what's your first thing when you thought of this?
Well, you know, it's the concept called the long tail. So no longer are we all watching the same blockbuster movies. We don't all go see the movie Jaws. We don't buy Michael Jackson's album. Now we can find the content that we like. And all I really need is a few million people that want to log in, watch my stuff, buy my stuff from my advertisers, and I win. So I can find these little niche sports like MMA. I can find someone who wants to hear about a bodybuilder, Dorian Yates from Britain, talk about for an hour and a half. So I can kind of hit these small target audiences with this kind of online delivered media. So it's an exciting time.
All right, we got about a minute left. I want to touch on another subject here in terms of government and media. So here, there's some spark of a success in the Silicon Roundabout area. It seems like the government, mayor's office, have kind of like woken up to this and are now like glomming onto it, in my opinion.
There's a lot of media appearances.
So is that helpful or hurtful? Because in other words, I mean, you could make the case, oh, it's helpful. They're coming in with some money. They're coming in with some awareness. But on the same token, you could say it might be hurtful because these are the same bureaucrats that have kept us from growing for decades. Do you really want them coming in at this point, or what do you think?
It's nice to see Boris coming out and kissing babies and shaking hands, and that only helps when the government's getting involved. But what we really need is, you know, the immigration reform. We've had some great tax treatment, but we really need to see it and feel it on the ground, whether it comes to broadband speeds and all that kind of things.
Broadband speeds. That's one thing they definitely need in this country. Boris, if you're listening, we need world-class broadband speeds. It's still dial-up. All right, Brian Rose, we're out of time. Thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max. Appreciate it.
All right, and that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report. With me, Max Keiser, and Stacey Herbert. I'd like to thank our guest, Brian Rose of London Real TV. If you'd like to get in touch, tweet us at Keiser Report. Until next time, bye, y'all.